Hey, quick question. How many racing games do you know from Nintendo? Well, there's Mario Kart 8 Deluxe on the Switch, there's Mario Kart 7 on the 3DS, there's Mario Kart Wii. Oh yeah, and all the other ones. It's obvious that Mario Kart has become Nintendo's biggest racing franchise, and it's no wonder why, because Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, you just look at the sales numbers on that, sold over like 60 million units at this point. It is an extremely successful series that appeals to everyone, so obviously Nintendo's gonna keep making those. But in the wake of Mario Kart, Nintendo has left a lot of other games that they've made in the past that have just not seen entries in forever. You've probably heard about F-Zero, which has been gone for decades. Diddy Kong Racing only ever got one entry, but one game that I don't really hear enough about is actually Wave Race. This is actually a series of games that started on the Game Boy, and it lasted all the way to 2001 with Wave Race Blue Storm on the GameCube. And ever since then, that series has just been dead entirely. It's been over 20 years, and there's been no new entries. And I think it's about time for that to change now that the Switch 2 is coming. So first, I just want to take a quick look at what Wave Race is. So as I said, Wave Race is a series that started all the way back on the Game Boy in 1992. And that's pretty crazy to think about. So I've never played this one or haven't, and looking at footage now is it's so strange to see this top-down jet ski racing game because I grew up with Wave Race 64, the sequel, and that game just makes so much sense in the 3D space with this behind the character camera. Like it just makes total sense for the kind of game that it is. And to see this top-down perspective in Wave Race, it just doesn't feel like it makes any sense, and it doesn't feel like it would be as fun. But I guess the game did well enough that Nintendo thought it deserved a sequel. So we jumped to Wave Race 64. So we go from the Game Boy with black and white 2D graphics to full 3D color everything on the Nintendo 64. And man, what a leap. Wave Race 64, I grew up with this game, and it is actually really good. I revisited it recently for this video, playing it on the Nintendo Switch Online service, and it is really, really good. So Wave Race 64 is super impressive for a number of reasons. First off, it's the physics and the water. Like, the Nintendo 64 was like the first generation of 3D graphics that Nintendo really did, and it was very rudimentary compared to what we have today. But the water in Wave Race 64 is really impressive. You get a lot of waves of different heights, different intensities. There's a lot of like jumping around. Your jet ski reacts to all of these waves all the time. You have to take that into consideration when you're piloting your jet ski because it really affects your trajectory and how you can control your watercraft. It's very important to be mindful of the waves in order to traverse the stages. And it's super impressive to see that on the Nintendo 64 with the quality that it has. Like you look at a game like Mario Kart 64 and they couldn't even model the characters in 3D. And then you have Wave Race 64 where everything is 3D rendered. It looks pretty good for the time. The water looks amazing, and the physics are really, really impressive for that era. It's a really, really well executed game. And what I really like about this game that I'm gonna come back to with the next entry is the controls too, because Wave Race 64, the physics are complex and there's a lot going on. The tracks get really complicated in the hardest difficulties, but the game is very easy and natural to control. So the game does get very challenging and difficult as you progress, but you never really feel like it's your fault if you do badly at something. So it just is an enjoyable experience even when it's frustrating. And overall, it's just a really great game. Like the physics are great, the graphics are great, the gameplay is great, the visuals are really nice. I always had a soft spot for the second course in the championship, Sunset Bay. I think I've always had a thing for objects not being the color you'd expect them to be. So I really like the orange water in this stage. It's a very weird thing to be passionate about, I guess. But I don't know. I always really enjoy the fact that water was orange in this level. So that's probably one of my favorites, if not my favorite. And yeah, it's just the whole game is very fun. I only really focus on the championship part with the race, But there is also a stunt mode where you can do all kinds of tricks for points and things like that. I think it's for points. I actually don't know for sure. But I never really care about the side modes in racing games like that. I like focusing on the actual racing personally. But there is some variety. And Wave Race 64 is excellent overall. I really, really like that game. And then there's Wave Race Blue Storm on the GameCube, the last game in the series, and it is actually a launch title for the GameCube, which I just found out doing research for this video. Wave Race Blue Storm takes everything from Wave Race 64 and kind of takes it to the next level. Does that make for a fun game? No, not really. So here's the thing. Wave Race Blue Storm does elevate a lot of the things that Wave Race 64 did. The graphics are obviously better, and the one thing that people praise the most and is most impressive for that time is, again, the water physics. Because, on Wave Race 64, the water is super impressive and its behavior is pretty realistic for what it was. But it was always the same within the race. Like every race that you do in the championship, the behavior of the waves would be predictable. It could change based on the difficulty, but every time you did the same race, it would behave exactly the same way. Wave Race Blue Storm introduces a very complex system where there's weather in each track, which was also on the Nintendo 64 to some extent. But here, the weather affects the waves in the track, and it's randomized. So every time you race on a given course, the weather might be different, the waves will be different, and it actually changes during the race. So it's never a predictable experience when you go into the race. You actually have to know how to react to different situations in order to be able to, perform well in the game. So it's way more realistic and just way more innovative because, there's so much to consider now. You're never really prepared for what's going to happen. You kind of just have to have a steady mind and be ready for whatever comes at you. So it's way more realistic in that sense. And it's, for the time, again, it was super impressive. It also looks way better. The water looks great. And, it's just an upgrade in general. There's more characters, which is nice. Now there's 8 characters per race instead of 4. So it's a big upgrade, like just having just 4 characters, in a racing game is kind of lame. You look at Mario Kart, they've always had 8 up until the Wii game where it became 12. So, having just 4 was a little bit lame in that sense. Having 8 is definitely better. And yeah, in that sense, Wave Race Blue Storm is obviously an upgrade. But the big problem with Wave Race Blue Storm for me is the difficulty. If there's one thing that I have very, very low tolerance for in gaming, is games that make themselves difficult by nature of having very poor or loose controls that you need a lot of time to get used to. That's not fun. It makes the game very unapproachable. And Wave Race Blue Storm took this perfect formula of Wave Race 64, where the controls are really snappy and responsive, and just completely destroyed it. In Wave Race Blue Storm, your controls are really delayed, for one thing. Like when you tilt the stick, it doesn't immediately turn. It doesn't feel like it's responding to your actions immediately. But what's even worse is that when it does, it's super sensitive to your movements. So you think you're not turning, so you turn harder in hopes that you'll be able to make a turn. And then suddenly you're turning into the wall because it's a corner or something and you're turned too hard. And this happens all of the time. And especially not even with walls, but with the buoys, because you have to pass the red buoys on the right and the yellow buoys on the left. And it's just so hard because you have to keep swerving from one side to the other. The controls feel really delayed. They turn way too hard. You have to be really careful with tilting the analog stick. And it's just so difficult. So for context, I beat Wave Race 64, the first 3 cups, normal, hard, and expert, within like 3 days of starting that game, now when I picked it up on Switch. I still haven't beaten the hard difficulty, the second one, in Wave Race Blue Storm. I just can't, and I'm probably never going to, because it's so hard to nail the controls. You can learn them. Like, there are people that I know are passionate about that kind of stuff, and they like learning the controls of a game. But to me, that's not fun. When you make a game hard by making it hard to control, That's not fun. That's not challenging. It's frustrating. It alienates people who want to play the game for the first time. Wave Race Blue Storm is not an approachable game, and I'm not surprised that this is kind of what killed the series. Now, Wave Race 64 was developed by Nintendo internally in Japan, and Wave Race Blue Storm was actually handed off to an American studio from Nintendo called Nintendo Software Technology. And that studio, today, they actually make really good games. They mostly help with like Mario games and ports and stuff. But recently they've done F-Zero 99, for example, and that's a fantastic racing game. It's mostly a retro-based type of game, but it's really good. And I do believe in the quality of that team. But I don't know what is going on with Wave Race Blue Storm. The difficulty is just off the charts. I cannot deal with it. It's too hard. Again, the controls are just so difficult. And the problem is, Wave Race 64 already knew how to be challenging. Like, it starts off really easy in the normal difficulty, but that allows you to get a grip on the controls and understand how everything works. And as difficult elements are added, you still feel like you're in control. You never feel like if you lose, it's your fault. Or like you never feel like it's the controls' fault, is what I mean. Because, the controls work well. It's just the tracks can get hard. There's a lot of obstacles. There's a lot of twists and turns that you need to do. And that in itself is challenging. But with Wave Race Blue Storm, none of that is gone. All of the tracks still have a lot of twists and turns, a lot of obstacles in the way. But to make it even worse, you have these annoying controls that you need to get to grips with from the very beginning. It's never an easy game. Even the normal difficulty took me a while to actually beat that cup because the controls just don't work well. It's so frustrating, and I have no tolerance for that kind of stuff. A game should be fun to control, and then you can add elements that make the game difficult. Wave Race 64 did that. I took a while to finish the Expert Cup in Wave Race 64, but I did it and I enjoyed it. Like, I got frustrated for losing, obviously, but I still wanted to keep going because I felt like I could improve. With Wave Race Blue Storm, I don't feel that way. The controls are just so hard that I don't think I'll ever really get a grip on them. I might just get lucky enough to get them to work that one time in one race. So I don't really want to play that game again. It's really annoying. So if I hate Wave Race Blue Storm that much, why am I even making this video? Well, Wave Race 64 proves that this game can actually be really fun. And I think the Switch 2 is actually the perfect opportunity to bring this kind of game back. So Wave Race, in both of these iterations, 64 and Blue Storm, was an amazing showcase for the power of the hardware that it was on. On the 64, it had great physics and great graphics for the console. It is super impressive what they managed to do. And on the GameCube, while the graphics weren't as impressive for what the hardware was, the physics were incredibly impressive, and the fact that the weather could change so randomly and affect the waves and everything, it was really impressive. There is a lot to this game, to these games, that makes them interesting from like a hardware perspective, a technical showcase perspective. So if you have the Switch 2 and you really want to show like how powerful this system is, I think a game like Wave Race would be perfect. I mean, just imagine how good the water could look on the game running on the Switch 2, like with the processing power that it has, and possible even support for some light ray tracing. Like, the water would look amazing. The physics could be more realistic than ever. It would just be fantastic. And also, please bring back the orange water. I missed that. But yeah, like, this game could look amazing, and on top of the water, of course, everything around it could look awesome. Like, I really liked in Blue Storm how varied the environments were. A lot of the tracks were reused from Wave Race 64, but they were a lot more detailed. And it was very nice, and I think they could do so much more with the graphical prowess of something like a Switch 2. That'll be reason number one. I think if Nintendo wants to show how powerful this new system is, Wave Race would be a really great game to do that, because it's got so much potential to explore that power with the water physics and graphics. It could look awesome. And then, like, the game at its core is fun. Wave Race 64 is really fun. So if they bring that back, if they can make this game again with accurate, responsive controls like Wave Race 64 was, I think this would be a ton of fun to play. You know, it'll just be a fun game to play. Like you could have a championship, of course, for single player. You could have championships, and I think they could have a way bigger emphasis on multiplayer for the first time, because I mean, all three games on that we had before did support multiplayer, but obviously it was like local multiplayer. The internet wasn't really a thing. So to have this game with maybe like, instead of 8, just go up to 12 racers maybe in a race, and you have online play, I think having the fun physics, the complex physics with good controls, which the GameCube game didn't have. But if you do have good controls, these very complex physics with great graphics, you'll have a game with a very high skill ceiling that people would want to get invested in and play online a lot. I do think if they do that, they would also need to provide substantial single-player content. So Wave Race 64 and Blue Storm, you know, they have the championships, which have like 3 cups each, or 4. There's a reverse cup, at least in Wave Race 64. But, you know, they're pretty basic. There's not a lot of tracks there. So I think they would need to provide more content in terms of the tracks and the single-player. But, you know, you combine the racing tracks maybe, and then you have, if you could add like a more dedicated stunt arena or multiple of them, make it more of a stunt focus. I think what actually they could do is have 2 sort of racing modes. One that's just racing, and actually just remove the option to do stunts. Actually, you don't need to remove it, because the stunts do give you the option to get turbos faster. So it could reward more experienced players. But have a mode where the racing is the biggest focus, and then have a mode with maybe more comfortable tracks where not only do you have to race, but you have to do stunts, and you know, both the place that you finish in and how many stunts you do gives you points, kind of like how Excite Truck works on the Wii. I don't know if you play that, but that's also a game where, you know, winning the race gives you a lot of points, but you also have to do tricks during the race to get more points, and what gives you the actual win in the end is having the most points. So you have to combine stunts with finishing first, and I think having that mode in Wave Race would make a ton of sense, because they clearly care about the stunt mode. So just add that, combine that in a way that makes for an interesting, you know, single player experience. And I think they could like build a proper campaign where you maybe play as a character like with a story or something, and they just combine all of this. You know, you have normal races, you have just stunt competitions, and then you have those races where you have the points from stunts and racing. And if you combine all of these elements, you could make a more substantial single-player offering. And then, because there's such a high skill ceiling in Wave Race games, I feel like you could have a fantastic online community that is really invested in it. And, you know, with long-term support, if you could, you know, just keep adding new tracks over time, I think there's potential for something really cool there. And yeah, I think that would make Wave Race a potential big success. You know, it's never been a big franchise, but I think if there is a good time to reintroduce it, it would be now. It would have this really, really cool, you know, both, it could have a cool single player component and a fantastic multiplayer component that it hasn't really had the chance to explore as well, because, you know, it was always on consoles without internet and consoles that sold very poorly, so it was very unlikely that you had a lot of people to play these games with. But now on the Switch 2, you could really explore that to its fullest potential. So I think Wave Race should make a comeback. No, everyone asks for F-Zero or Diddy Kong Racing, and I would love to see those too. But Wave Race doesn't get enough attention, and you know, Wave Race 64 is really, really fun. Wave Race Blue Storm was not fun, but it had potential to be fun, and it was a very impressive technical showcase for the GameCube. That I can't deny. So I think if they take that spirit of really pushing the hardware to its limits and just make this beautiful, beautiful game for the Switch 2 that really leverages that extra power, and they improve the controls, they bring back the smooth controls from the Nintendo 64 game, and they build in enough content to make this like a long-lasting experience, they could make this like a full retail game that people actually cared about, or if they want to be a little more conservative. I feel like they could maybe do a thing where they charge like $50 for it, kind of like they do for the WarioWare games, like a slightly lower price. Make it, so it doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles that you want from like a really high-end experience. But I still think that game would have worth if you charge 50 or $40 for it. Just having this really beautiful technical showcase with fun gameplay, because Wave Race is fun. It doesn't have to be the deepest experience. You can charge a little bit less, and it would still be a great deal. So yeah, I think it would be awesome to see Wave Race return. I think Nintendo Software Technology could probably develop it again. I don't think it would be done internally at Nintendo in any case, so it has to be either NST or some external studio that Nintendo would contract to do it. I can't really imagine Nintendo developing this internally, and that's fine. They just need to have enough oversight to make sure that the game is made in a fun way, which I feel like didn't really happen with Wave Race Blue Storm. But yeah, this series has a ton of potential, and I just kind of wanted to talk about it a little bit. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hey, before you leave, as usual, I am streaming tonight again. We are continuing to watch every Nintendo Direct presentation of the Switch era. We have just wrapped up 2017 last week, so we're going to move on to 2018. And I would love to see you. I start streaming at around 11 p.m. GMT, which is 6 p.m. Eastern Time, or 3 p.m. Pacific Time. And I would love to see you there. Also, if you have a topic you'd like me to cover in a future video, let me know, because I am all for any suggestions you have. So yeah, let me know. Thanks again. Bye.